out of the blue. When you're 16 years old, every day in school is an endless stretch of time. All I could think of while sitting in every mathematics class was the very moment I could walk away from that building. Yet that day, what was boredom and laziness became true panic. What I'm about to tell you is something that forever changed everyone in that classroom. I couldn't have guessed in a million years that I was going to witness death in first person that afternoon. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Let's rewind. I was 16, as I said before, and bored to death while Miss Malloy was rambling on and on about the weird angle in a weird triangle none of us cared about. Right at the moment she turned around to ask the students if any of us had any random idea about what she had just said, there was a knock on the door. She was puzzled because nobody was ever late to her class. She would literally scream at you in front of the entire grade. That wasn't cool, not cool at all. But the knock on the door was very real. In fact, there was another knock and another one. The strange visitor was in somewhat of a hurry. Mrs. Malloy was as strict as the strictest mathematics teacher you can think of. She followed the school's rule book perfectly to the last comma. Therefore, she wasn't just going to open the door to any stranger, but when she asked who was it, the response was a voice on the edge of breakup saying weakly and hurtfully, "Please, let me in. Have to let me in." Mrs. Malloy took a step back. Tom and I were sitting at the back of the room, and from there we could see her pale face. Her body was stiff. I felt a rush of adrenaline from the bottom of my spine straight to my brain. That sixth sense we all have that gets ignited by danger definitely went on. There was another knock. She looked at the door, her eyes open wide, her fists closed. There was another knock, harder than before. She asked who was behind the door again, and the response was an even louder knock. She looked at us. We were all scared at that point. "You have to let me in," said the voice from the other side of the door again. Mrs. Malloy just lost it and screamed, "Go away! I'm calling security! I don't care who you are!" The knocks on the door became kicks, and the loud thumps got louder. Our teacher was trying to type on her phone, but her trembling hands let it fall, and it made a loud noise as it hit the floor. I could clearly see she was on the brink of a panic attack. Don't ask me why, but I just ran to the front of the classroom to help her. I'm not a hero. Anyone would have done the same. Whoever it was, the person kicking the door, we were in danger and needed to call for help. Right after I gave my phone to Mrs. Malloy, I put my shoulder against the door, pushing out. I wanted to stop whatever or whoever was outside from coming in. Tom came to help me. Then Jack came running. Next was Linda, and right after her, Joss joined too. Soon, half the class was pushing back against the door, working together. The kicks stopped, and so did the knocks and thumps. Suddenly, the once weak voice became really loud, but in a very low pitch, almost guttural. "I hope you remember me, Mrs. Malloy. Do you remember me? You ruined my life. I'll ruin yours too, right now." I heard the man step back and kick the door even harder. We had to make an effort to keep it in place. "I will kill you. I will kill all of you." My body was completely paralyzed, stuck in the same position. All I could do was push against the door with all my strength. I looked around me and all faces were of panic. Some were crying. The principal's voice came on the PA and announced the lockdown, so all of us went to sit at the corner of the room and all the building's lights went off. We heard someone running down the hallway. The voice said, "I hate you, Vivian Malloy. You don't care about anything but yourself. I warned you about this. You just wouldn't listen." The next thing we heard was a gunshot. I can remember to this day the smell of gunpowder floating in the air, and the noise of the shot is something that haunts me in my sleep still. The classroom window appeared bright red after the lights went on. He'd used the gun to shoot himself in the head. Mrs. Malloy burst into tears and ran towards the door, screaming the man's name, Mike. Her high-pitched voice was piercing, and she fell to the ground before reaching the door. All classes were dismissed for the day, of course. I saw Mrs. Malloy leaving in an ambulance. She could barely walk. I, instead, walked home after talking to the police. My ears were still ringing, and I couldn't sleep that night. I put my head on the pillow, and all I could hear was the gunshot and Mrs. Malloy screaming. She came back to school after 2 weeks to pick up her stuff. She was moving from Orlando to Philadelphia because our small town had become a little hostile to her. She started by apologizing and then told us that the man who took his own life in front of our classroom was her ex-husband, who was an alcoholic and a drug addict. They'd been divorced for the past 5 years, but he suddenly appeared out of the blue as if nothing happened, pretending they were still married, trying to break into her house where she lived with her new partner. The police already knew about him but couldn't catch Mike on time. He said to her that they were meant to be together from the beginning of time and to the end of time, and also that if she refused to see the truth, he was going to end his life. She said to us she thought it was just another of his threats, but he finally did it that afternoon. As for myself and my classmates, we were forever changed. That was the first time I ever felt true fear and acted out of courage in a difficult situation. After school, I understood I had to help others and become a fireman. Although the feeling of fear never left me, I'm still the one running into the flames to save those in need, as I did with Mrs. Malloy almost a decade ago. The swimming team. I was on the swimming team back then. We would meet in the school's gymnasium 3 times a week. It was fun because I was allowed to skip a couple of morning classes to just go swimming. I mean, I live in a coastal city and have pretty much been swimming since I was born. Yet, I never knew that it was going to be such a handy skill when the school fell under terror that morning. We were lucky, I guess, but I don't think I could have made it out intact if it wasn't for my swimming skills. But the story starts a little before that morning. We were a swimming team, as I said before. There were 6 of us, all the same age. We were the fastest swimmers in school, and if you asked me, we were the fastest in the world. The team had a captain who wasn't me. It was Mario, a tough guy. He was a wrestler originally, but could use the same huge musculature to move in the water faster than any of us. He knew that if he kept on working hard, he could even make it to the Olympics one day. But there was something very bad about Mario. He was a bully. He liked going around pushing people and using those bigger-than-life arms to bury fellow students' heads inside their lockers. Nobody could stand up to him because he was the toughest of us all. I also knew, because my mom worked in the city hall, that he came from a troubled home. His dad was an alcoholic, and he had a rough upbringing in one of the city's toughest neighborhoods. Mario and I were friends, though. I wasn't afraid of him, but I didn't agree with the things he did to other people. Mario would always laugh about it and took every abuse as a golden medal to add to his chest. Everybody laughed. I didn't. The week before that crazy lockdown morning, Mario had gotten a little too far by hanging a student upside down from the biggest tree in school. The kid's clothes ripped apart and he fell and broke his collarbone. He'd been suspended for the week, too small a punishment in my opinion. Either way, nothing made him more furious than being forced to spend time with his family at home. It's his version of a nightmare. The morning of this story, he was more upset than he usually was, and he was also beating his own records. He was faster than he had ever been. The rest of us, the remaining 5, were doing our best to keep up with the captain, but scoring times above our average. He came out of the water right before the training session was over and screamed to us all, "You're a bunch of losers. When I make it to the national team, you'll remember my name. It'll be up there in a golden plaque of honor. Mario Goldwyn, golden medal, trained in this pool." All of us thought Mario could do it if he really pushed himself. He had a promising future if he could manage to stay out of trouble long enough. That morning, though, karma would play a very bad move on Mario. As soon as he finished saying that in a very loud voice, the lights went off in the gym and the principal's voice announced the lockdown. We were supposed to run to the locker room and wait for further instructions, but as soon as we started walking that way, some of the glass in the windows close to the roof fell to the floor and exploded. We looked at each other and started running toward the safe spot. Another explosion, and the ceiling got illuminated for a second. I could hear something that made a noise close to that of a bee above our heads. Mario, who was claiming he was a hotshot a minute ago, was petrified on the side of the pool. He was in shock. A big piece of glass had fallen on his right foot and he was bleeding profusely. The coach grabbed him and with a huge effort picked him from the floor to take him to the locker room. Another explosion above our heads and another shower of glass fell upon us. The coach was hit in the head by a fairly big piece and fell to the ground. I could hear security trying to open the gymnasium door. It was all the way across the pool on the other side. I jumped into the water and broke the fastest mark I ever had while reaching out for the other end of the pool. I swam underwater as much as I could, and when I couldn't hold my breath anymore, I touched the wall with my right arm. If I hadn't swam that morning, the myriad of glass pieces falling over us would have hurt me really bad. I made it out and opened the door. A police officer and 3 security members aimed up and shot at something moving. A couple of seconds later, an avant-garde drone fell next to my feet. Although the artifact was almost destroyed, I could clearly see it was painted with camouflage paint. Mario's assailant was the son of a retired U.S. Air Force officer who had access to war drones capable of doing such a thing as breaking glass or destroying property. He wanted to get back at Mario for what he did to his son the week prior, so he decided to scare us. He was spotted trespassing on school property and maneuvering the drone from the roof. That was the initial lockdown issued by the principal. Then he was arrested by the police in conjunction with the school security team. Mario's foot took forever to be completely healed, and the time he spent away from the pool made him get into some serious trouble. To make a long story short, he went to jail a couple of years later. I kept on swimming and eventually made it to the national team. Although I haven't competed to represent my country yet, I can see my name on that golden plaque above the pool already. After all, it was my swimming that saved the coach and Mario's lives as well as my own that day. Francis and the Madmen. When I started in that school as a freshman, I could have never envisioned the number of things I was going to live within those walls. My first romance, the definite bond with my best friends, the huge deception of my first broken heart, forming my first band, playing my first gig, winning a big game, it all happened in that school. But what I'm about to tell you is perhaps what I remember the most. Yes, during my last year in the institution, I lived through one of the scariest moments in my life. Moreover, it's a memory just as vivid as the timid first kiss I gave my junior high girlfriend behind the classroom door when nobody was watching. I was 17 at the time, and it was a hot day at the beginning of May. We were all experiencing the magic of the last days together as a group of friends before the life of each of us would take us in different directions. Some of us were going to college, some others weren't, but we all shared that feeling of the end of an era. It really was. That day, we spent some time talking about the future with Mark and Jennifer, two of my best friends at the time. Jen wanted to be an engineer, so she was going away to college as soon as classes started. Mark, on the other hand, was going to follow his dad's steps and work in the family business. As for me, I was going to move to Los Angeles to pursue a career in music. I'd been accepted to Berklee and was foreseeing huge success playing the drums. After all, it was all I ever dreamed of since I could hold drumsticks. We were called to class and we were still chit-chatting as we walked into the classroom. The teacher was Mr. Frowner, a history teacher who seemed to me old enough to have lived all of humankind's most relevant times. His body seemed fragile, but he gave brilliant explanations about all kinds of subjects. History, along with music, was one of my favorite subjects during those years. We sat down, the three of us, and noticed a student was missing. His name was Francis, and he was a quiet kid who didn't have many friends. I had only spoken with him a couple of times, but he sat directly next to me, so I noticed the empty space. I raised my hand and told Mr. Frowner that a student was missing. Jen looked at me, then at the empty spot, and I could see some tears welling up in her eyes. Did she know something I didn't? At the time, it felt odd, so I whispered, asking what the matter was and why she was crying. She looked at me and said, "I hope I'm mistaken, don't worry about it." Yet the expression on her face didn't change. Mr. Frowner left the classroom and went looking for Francis. His movements were slow but determined. I felt something that I could describe as worry rather than panic. Something was not right, and I somehow knew it. I don't know how long Mr. Frowner was out, but it seemed like an eternity. The entire classroom began to raise their voices and make loud noise talking to each other. That was until we heard the first thumping noise. It came from the hallway. It sounded like a locker being smashed. We went silent, all of us, immediately. What in the world was happening outside? Jen looked at me, stopped crying, and grabbed my hand. Her eyebrows went up, her eyes were wide open, and she was covering her mouth with the other hand. Mark, instead, got up and went over to the door's small window to see outside. Before he could get there, another thumping noise made him stop on the spot. He was completely frozen. There was no news about Francis or Mr. Frowner, but there was definitely something wrong going on outside. That's when we heard the first scream. It was Francis's voice. Although I had only heard it a few times, I could recognize it instantly. The lights went off, the lockdown was announced, and I had to run to where Mark was to bring him to the classroom corner where we should wait. The thump and the screaming repeated a couple of times, and then we heard something close to a burst of laughter coming from outside. Someone was banging on every locker and laughing as he was running through the hallway. Suddenly, Mr. Frowner came into the classroom. He was pale as a sheet of paper and completely speechless. He locked the door and just walked across the room in a complete state of awe to where we were sitting and joined us in silence. As soon as one of us asked him what happened, he just took his index finger to the lips and asked us to shut up. A loud noise, some screams, and a struggle could be heard right outside our classroom's door. We heard something that seemed like a fight, sirens coming from outside the building. 1 minute later, the police screamed and there was a big fight that seemed to last forever. Unexpectedly, there were some knocks on our door. The knocks became frantic punches that then turned into kicks. It was Francis's voice asking us to let him in, begging to be let in. Mr. Frowner moved as fast as he could to open the door and let our quiet classmate in. His hair was a mess and he was even paler than Mr. Frowner. They hugged on the spot and our history teacher brought Francis with the rest in the dark corner of the classroom. It took the police 15 minutes to handle the situation outside, and finally, after what seemed as an eternity, the lockdown was lifted. Some highly disturbed patients had escaped the local institution and had stormed the school screaming and banging things around. Francis was on his way to the classroom when he was intercepted by these troubled individuals. He was forced to run and hide inside the janitor's room. The principal saw it all through the school's cameras and issued the lockdown while calling the cops. The madmen found Francis and tried to beat him up, but he escaped not once, but twice. When the cops arrived, he just ran and entered the classroom almost without a scratch. Mr. Frowner said they laughed at him and his life was spared, I guess, for being an old man. When the police officers could take care of the situation, they found a bloody knife in the hands of one of the attackers. He'd used it to kill a guard and escape the institution. We were in real danger if he made it inside the classroom. Jen knew Francis was being treated for depression and was afraid he hurt himself. That's why she was crying. But Francis was the boldest of us all, bold enough to face the madmen and escape. We became great friends. Jen, Mark, Francis, and I still call each other on that date to talk about what happened that afternoon and comfort each other. It's very rare for me to go to sleep and not hear Francis screaming or see Mr. Frowner's puzzled eyes and pale face. I think that speaking about it every year brings comfort to our minds, and every year the memory is a little less powerful than the previous one.